Word of commendation to our parents who might be wrestling somebody in their seat, maybe a young child. We say this from time to time. We commend you. Keep wrestling. It's worth it. To have your kids in God's house, you are teaching them what is most important. You are modeling for them faith and worship, and that will last a lifetime. And so as a church, we support you. We're flexible with you. There was some study done a number of years ago. It was summarized in a book called Sticky Faith, and one of the findings of the study is that there's a higher percentage of connection to the church throughout life if a child or a youth is known by at least 5 adults who are not their parent in the church. So if there are 5 adults who know a child or a youth by name, know something about them, that will outlast, that person will find them out when they're 25 or 35. That relationship, multi-generational, lasts a lifetime. So before we begin the sermon, let's just take a moment to greet those around us, especially if you're by a child. Make sure you give a high five to a child or youth around you. Ready, go. All right, I'm going to have to cut it short, otherwise we'll be here all day. So find a seat. Thank you for taking a moment to do that. Last week we talked about the fact that there are some things that happen to you, and when it happens to you, you can never be the same. And so things like, what's my favorite cake? Anybody remember? German chocolate. Okay, if you were here last week, okay, so like German chocolate cake, just like moist cake, the frosting drizzled over it, right out of the saucepan. It has to be like immediately. Well, it's still warm. Once you've had German chocolate cake, you just can't be the same. If you've been to a World Series game, or if you were there when the Cards won the World Series, boy, that you could never be the same after that. Experiencing a solar eclipse, or certainly a relationship, somebody, a best friend, a spouse, somebody that's changed your life. Once you've met them, you just can never be the same. There are some things that happen to you. It happens, and you just can't be the same anymore. And so it was for the early Christian church. As you can imagine, we talked last week. They witnessed the brutal death and execution of their friend, Jesus of Nazareth. He was buried in a grave. You can imagine if you saw somebody that you knew put in a coffin, and then that coffin lowered into the ground, and then dirt shoveled on top of it. And then 3 days later, some women went to the tomb, and there was no one there, except some angel messengers who said, "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen." And then after that, they started to see him in the flesh. And so imagine you saw somebody buried, you went to the committal service at the cemetery, and then you start to see them 3 days later alive. And in the coming days, more and more people saw this man alive. And they touched him and talked with him and ate with him. And once you see that, once you've seen the risen Jesus, you cannot be the same. You can imagine if you were in the first century and you experienced that, you could not be the same. Life could never be the same. And so, too, one of Jesus' first disciples, John, who lived the longest of the 12 apostles, who wrote the Gospel of John, and we're in one of the letters of John. He wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, wrote them later in the first century. He, too, could not be the same. And we get that sense in his letters that there are implications to the resurrection of Jesus. You can't just go to church on Easter Sunday and be like, yep, he's risen, and then go back to life as normal. You can't, it doesn't make sense. You can't do that. Your life has to be different because you've experienced a miracle in Jesus Christ. And so too with John, he said, this is different now. Life is different. And we see in 1 John last week, one of those implications, you just can't be the same, was we just can't live with this persistent sin anymore, deliberate persistent sin. And this week, we focus on another implication in 1 John. Another implication of the resurrection, a way in which we just can't be the same anymore. We're going to look at 1 John 3, verse 11. If you'd read with me. For this is the message you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. If you've experienced the risen Jesus, you cannot be the same. And one way in which you cannot be the same is you are called to live the command that he gave, love one another. You have to take seriously that command because the Lord who gave it is alive. Now, I have to be honest, love one another, love each other. Sometimes it can seem a little bit like fluff. Something you'd see on a hippie bumper sticker. Love one another. A little bit like cotton candy. Got a lot of sugar and air, but not a lot of substance. And sometimes the command to love one another, love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus repeated it numerous times, and John does too, it might wear a little thin and it might seem a little flimsy. And so today I want to take it a couple levels deeper so that you see that this command has some grit to it. Some historical context. In the late 1st century AD and first couple of centuries, there was a Christian heresy that began to spread. And that's part of the backdrop of 1 John. John is speaking in that context. And so the thing called Gnosticism. Just say Gnosticism. Fun to say. Now, never say it again because it's a heresy, okay? But in Gnosticism, there was this belief that the physical world and the flesh was bad and the spiritual was good. And so anything that was physical was kind of secondary or even evil, and only the spirit was the true and the pure and the good. And so for Gnostics, they believe, or they didn't believe, that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God, because why would God take on flesh, which is evil? And by extension, they did not believe in a bodily resurrection of Jesus, because why would the flesh matter? It was a spirit. For them, it was just a spiritual resurrection. In fact, some of the Gnostics believed that Jesus was never a body, that he was only a spirit who appeared to be like a body, but he was only a spirit. So that was part of the heresy, is that Jesus had no flesh. He wasn't a person, but just a spirit. And so there was this separation of the physical and the spiritual. And Gnosticism believed that they boasted that they had this secret knowledge. And the goal of Gnosticism was to escape this physical evil world and to let your spirit escape it and be free from it. That was the goal of Gnosticism. So, with that as a context and a backdrop, now listen to John. It makes a little more sense because he's speaking subtly to this heresy. This is 1 John 3:18. If you'd read with me. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Now you start to see this command of love and that it takes on flesh and action. John is subtly taking jabs at Gnosticism, and he's saying this isn't just a spiritual religion. We don't just talk about love, or we don't just blabber on about it. It's not just word, but it's also deed and truth. That there is something real and physical to this command to love. There's something real about the love of God in Jesus Christ. The Christian faith is is not divorced from this world of matter and physical stuff. And once you've experienced the risen Jesus, you cannot be the same. You are called to action. So Gnosticism would say, flee the world, get out of this evil flesh and physical world and flee it. John says, no, run into it. Into deed and in truth. Love in that way. Not just as an idea or a sentiment, but in action with your life. John goes on in verse 23. If you'd read this with me. And this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as he commanded us. Notice what John does here. He ties together belief and action. So this is the commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. Belief and action and love, they're tied together. They're bound together. It's not just that you would kind of believe in this Jesus and by that knowledge or by that belief be this super spiritual person that would escape the world, but you believe and you love one another. You live in this world and you express the love that you have first been shown in this world. Belief and action are tied together. Your belief in Christ informs your action. Believe in the name of his Son Jesus and love one another. Which means that the love of Christ will inevitably touch every part of your life. Your real life. Not just like your church life. And then you leave and it's like, well, the love of Christ was there and then I go to work or school or the game. It'll touch every part of your life. The love of Christ will invade your phone and your calendar, your time. The love of Christ will invade your family and your work, your possessions and your bank account. It will find its way out in real stuff and in action. John said, you don't just love in talk, but in deed and in truth. And that finds its way out in everyday, ordinary life. 168 hours a week. This is his commandment. Believe and do action. Love one another. We are not Gnostics. That heresy is dead. In fact, there is no Gnostic church anymore because it proved itself empty and false. We are not Gnostics who only believe that this thing is about the spiritual. God's love encompasses the spiritual, yes, and the physical. He created it. He has come to redeem it. And so it matters to him. So the love of Christ covers everything. And so the Christian must take this command seriously. It's not fluff. Love one another. Love one another. It sounds simple. But will you love those who are difficult to love? Will you love those that you are feuding with right now? Love one another. It seems simple. You put it on a bumper sticker. But will you love others by being generous with your money and your possessions? Will you love in that way if it touches your bank account? Love one another. It's easy to say. You can put it on an inspirational cat poster. But will you love your enemies? Jesus said. Would you even love your enemies? In real ways. Not just in talk. Will you love by giving your time? Will you be gracious to those with whom you disagree? Will you forgive those who hurt you? Love one another is really easy to say, but John is taking it to another level today. To love not just in talk, to blab about it, but in deed and in truth, to do something with it. There are two words that are kind of a deal in our church, loved and sent. They have been it's maybe been like 10 or 12 years. And in some ways, they become watchwords for our church. They sort of guide us. They kind of keep us focused on our mission. They always remind us of who we are. They help us make decisions so that we're focused and not distracted. They're biblical words. They're found both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. There are also words that are used in everyday language, so they're kind of bridge words that normal people who don't know the Bible could even use these words. So I wrote a book about these two words largely for you, for our church and ministry, but others have read it too. And for the most part, it's been useful. It's created relationships with churches across the country in a healthy way. There's been like just a little bit of criticism that I've heard that caught wind of, just like a little bit. It's not a big deal, but just a little criticism. And if I hear any criticism, it is that, in particular, the word love can be fluff. And Claytor's talking about love, and it's not meaty enough. It's not theologically robust enough or rigorous enough. It's too simplistic. So let me take it down another level. We're going to stay in 1 John. 1 John 4. Move to chapter 4, and I want you to read this with me. This is 1 John 4, verse 10. If you'd read with me. "In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." John says, in this is love. This is love. Not so much that we love God. That's fine. We're called to do that. But that's not the primary thing here. This is love. Not that we love God, but that he loved us. Okay, that's great. How did he love us? And sent his Son. God is a God of action, not just word and talk. But he did something. He sent. He deployed on a rescue mission. His Son Jesus on a perilous mission. Risked everything. Gave it away. Sent his Son to be what? To be a propitiation. It's a big word. Just say it. It's fun to say. Propitiation. Okay? Propitiation means like a blood sacrifice. In the sacrificial system, there are things, sins committed that need to be covered over, need to be forgiven, and God doesn't just brush the sin away or say, oh, it's not a big deal. If God is just, which he is, he has to maintain that justice. To maintain that justice, he has to do something with sin and not just ignore it. And so he has to pay a price, or a price has to be paid. Here, God chooses to pay the price with a blood sacrifice, a propitiation, a sacrifice that pays for the guilt of a crime, a sacrifice that maintains justice because it's dealt with, but it's dealt with by putting it on someone else, by the blood sacrifice of Jesus. And so this is love, that he loved us and sent to be a propitiation, that Jesus himself is the blood sacrifice. There was a cost to it. Verse 11, he goes on, if you'd read with me. "Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." Beloved, that's you. You are the beloved. If God so loved us, I want to draw your attention to one little tiny word. Look at the word so. It's just 2 letters. If God so loved us, that word so, it does not mean like a child with a stuffed animal squeezing it to death. I love this, I love my stuffed animal so much. That's not what that so means. So there means like in this way, thus. So if God so in this way loved us. It's the same word, by the way, in John 3:16. God so in this way loved the world. Okay, so, beloved, if God loved us in this way, and he's referring to the sentness of the Son, the propitiation, the blood sacrifice, the Son who came to suffer and to bleed and to risk all to give his very life. If God loved us in this way, we also ought to love one another. I don't think there's any fluff in that. And I think it ups the game for Christians. If God loved us in this way, to expend it all, we also ought to love one another, and in this way. You are not Jesus himself. You won't love perfectly as he has. Your love does not accomplish a propitiation for sin. But we are called to love, Jesus said, as I have loved you. In this way, we have the model and the forerunner before us. And the only way that you can love like Jesus, even just a little bit, the only way you can do it is because you have first been loved in this way. You have nothing to give except what you have first been given. That there is one who has loved you in this way, and that is the catalyst for you and any love that would come from you. Because when you've experienced the love of Christ, you cannot be the same. It's like German chocolate cake, or it's like that relationship that changed you. When you've experienced the risen Jesus, you just cannot be the same. So now, let us love, not just in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth. Amen. I ask you to